welcome to the second part of this three-part series on how to improve your garden bird photography. And if you watched last week's or last time's, it was all about preparation, getting everything set up, thinking about your perches, thinking about your backgrounds and observing the birds, etc. And if you haven't watched that, I'll put a link up to it here. This week, in this episode, I'm going to talk to you more about the technique of taking the shots. So things like the gear I use, the settings, the focusing, just lots of bits and pieces like that really. We'll start off with talking about the gear. So quite a few of you last week in the comments mentioned the hide. The hide is it's a bushwear TP hide. It's really easy to set up and put down. It's basically a pop-up hide. So it comes in like a circular package and you just let it go. It springs up into shape, and then all you've got to do is just knock in the corners with some tent pegs and just put some guy ropes on to protect it from the wind. And there you go. And putting it away is quite easy as well. I've done a little video that you can see me setting it up and putting it away. And there's also a separate video on it, which I'll link up here again. But it's nice. It's a two-man hide. It's nice and roomy. It's getting a bit old now, but it's been up like in situ really for most of the year. So it's got a bit of a tear up here, which happened when it was very cold. You do need to bring it in if it's excessively windy, because it will fall over. But other than that, it's done alright really, served me quite well. See, that was me talking about blue tits flying off and going up into trees in the last episode, and today this one's on the suet pellets, and it's literally just sitting there munching away, not a care in the world, not even thinking about flying off, mainly because it can't. There you go now. Oh, now you're on to that, and now you'll fly off. So let's talk about cameras and lenses and bits and pieces. So I shoot with a Sony. I've got a Sony A7R3, and that gives me pretty good results. It's got 42 megapixels, which is, fantastic. It's got a burst rate of I think 12 frames per second, which is actually quite important, but we'll move on to that later. But it's not all about the camera. Prior to this, I used the Sony A6000 for a while. Canon 5D Mark III, and a Canon 5D Mark III is really not made for wildlife. Shoots at 5 frames per second. It's a full frame camera. It's very few focus points. It's much more a landscape lens camera, but you can do perfectly adequate job with it. Prior to that, Canon 70D I've shot on before, Canon 7D. So it's not all about the camera, but there are a few points to consider if you're thinking of buying a camera for wildlife, or if you have a camera, is it good enough for wildlife? Well, some important things really are definitely your burst rate. So because if a bird comes and lands on here on one of these branches or one of these perches, I want to be able to get as many shots as I can of it in the shortest amount of time before it goes, and try and make sure I get one of them sharp, at least one of them sharp. So that's important. the focusing system, obviously the better the focusing system, the more success rate you're going to have, the more hits you're going to have rather than misses when it comes to taking the shots. And this isn't bad. I will say I had the Sony a7 III for a while before this, and although I much prefer this camera, that had a much better focusing system and was better for bird photography. You know, if you've got a good focusing system, then you're going to have more success again, aren't you? We'll talk about that as well a bit later on. In terms of the lens or lenses, I would say, you know, I'm shooting with, this is the Sigma 150-600, and we've got the little MC11 adapter here, which is needed to hook it up to the Sony, because the Sigma don't make a 150-600 specifically to fit the Sony. So this is a Canon fit with an MC11 Sigma adapter, and that has its drawbacks. I mean, it has its benefits because it's way cheaper than buying, like, you can buy a Sony 200-600, but the Sigma is a much cheaper lens, a much more affordable lens. Even if you add on the cost of the adapter, it's probably £600-700 less than the Sony lens. But then the drawbacks are, it's not a native lens, so, and it's not sitting on the mount, so it's got issues with a little bit of compatibility, so the focusing probably isn't as good as you would get if it was made specifically for Sony, but it still works fine. But when you're talking about lenses, I would say if you're shooting birds, I mean, here in the garden, the distance between me and the birds, I could probably, for the larger ones anyway, I could probably get away with 300mm, a 300mm lens. Anything less than that, you're starting to sort of eat into your resolution because you're having to crop in. You're not going to get as sharp images as you want to. Although I will say I took some images of, I set up a reflection pool last year. I'll pop the video up there. I set up a reflection pool last year, and the best shots I got on that were shot at 200mm because they were close enough for me to do that, and the background was far enough away to blow it out at 200mm f4, I think, 200mm f4. So you can do it with a 200mm lens, but I would say if you want to get those sharp, detailed photos and give yourself more variety of shots or opportunities to get shots, then you want to be looking along the lines of a, you know, 400-600mm lens, and that will really push you out there and up everything. Of course, expense is an issue, so you can do it with less. One of the problems though with shooting at 200mm, because you could say, well, look, I've got a 42 megapixel camera here, so why couldn't I shoot at 200mm and crop it in? Well, I could. Is the answer to that. I could shoot at 200mm and crop it in, but if I show you an example here, so I'm going to put something up on this log that doesn't look like a bird very much, but I will show you if I take a shot of it at 200mm and crop it in, and then take a shot of it at 600mm, with the background being the distance it is away from the log, look at the difference between the bokeh of the shot at 200mm cropped in and the shot at 600mm, and that's a big factor to take into consideration. If you're shooting at the longer focal lengths, then you don't need so much distance between you and the background, or the foreground and the background, to get a nice blown out background. Whereas if you're shooting it at a shorter focal length and cropping it in, then either you're going to have to shoot down at something like f2.8. If you've got 200mm f2.8, you might get away with it. But when you start to talk about an f4, f5.6 or whatever, you're going to be struggling. So I was mentioning earlier about this hide and how good it is. I should point out, you don't have to use a hide. You know, if you've got a garden, or if you've got a house where you've got some patio doors or something that looks out onto the garden, there's no reason why you can't shoot from inside your own house. I would recommend shooting with the door open. You don't really want to be shooting through a window because that's going to impede your quality of image a little bit. But certainly if you've got a garden, or a patio doors, or a set of doors that backs out onto your garden, there's no reason why you can't just sit in there with your doors open and shoot. Obviously you might want to think about putting a sheet up or some sort of blind up so the birds can't see you directly if they're close enough. But yeah, you can certainly do that. And I think another really important thing with your camera and the technique is knowing your camera, knowing the functions, knowing where all the buttons are and all the dials are and how to control it without thinking. So the last thing you want to be doing is thinking, right, I need to so I need to change the shutter speed now. How do I do that? Oh, there's a bird. Oh, yeah, I need to, and it's gone, and the bird's gone, and you've missed it. So, when I've got my camera up to my eye here, I know that this dial does the shutter speed. I know that this button up here will change me into APS-C mode. I know that if I move this trigger here, on the back, it's going to move my focus points. I know that if I press this button here, it's going to change my focusing system. It's second nature. I don't need to look down at the camera for anything. I don't need to look at it. I can look through the viewfinder and I can see here that I'm changing my shutter speed, and I can see what effect that's having. Yeah, basically just know your camera, know your way around it. And another piece of advice I would give, and to a point I would give this piece of advice, but everyone's going to do it a little bit, but don't spend your whole time chimping. Don't spend your whole time taking a shot, looking at the shot, taking a shot, looking at the shot on the screen, because all the time just sitting there looking at the shots, you're missing opportunities to get more birds. So if one pops along while you're sitting there looking at your camera screen, you're going to be gutted, especially if it's one that you haven't seen before. Good morning, goldfinch. They hardly ever come down on the feeders now, the goldfinches. They sit up in the trees eating the berries. I waited for ages for all of these to show up in the garden. Yeah, so get to know your camera, get to know everything you need to know about it and how to change it without having to look, without having to physically work it out on the menus of how to change it. So on my camera, for instance, I've got some programmable buttons, and one of them is the APS-C mode, which will then make the picture larger, if you like, in my viewfinder, which is very helpful. One of them changes the focus from eye autofocus human to eye autofocus animal. One of them switches on and off silent shutter. So those three, I think, are the most important three things for me for bird photography. On the other than the shutter speed and ISO and all those things, which I've already got buttons for, or dials. So those are the things that I've got set up. And if you can set those things up, let's see if I can get a shot of this actually. Or several hundred. And there's me chimping straight away. Oh, look at that. That's sharp. It's lovely. So let's talk now about the actual physical camera settings that I use for my bird photography. So first things first, I always shoot in shutter priority. Some people shoot in manual, some people shoot in aperture priority, but for me, the best method I find is shooting in shutter priority. And what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to shoot at the highest possible shutter speed where I can still get a decently editable, reasonably exposed image out. So I know this camera has a very good dynamic range, so I could probably shoot a couple of stops underexposed and still pull that detail out perfectly fine. So I'm looking to push that shutter speed as high as I can, even if it means I'm going to be underexposed slightly, meaning that I can freeze the birds, because the faster the shutter speed, the more chance of success I'm going to have of freezing that bird's movement. So I'm looking, ideally, if it's a nice bright sunny day, I'm looking at shooting up in the 1/2000th of a second range. But most of the shots that I take in the winter time, so about now when it isn't as bright as I'd like it to be, I'm shooting around about probably somewhere between 1/500th and 1/800th of a second. I think the lowest you can probably get away with, I feel, is about 1/250th of a second. So I'll go down as low as that, but I won't go any lower. And if it's a fast moving bird, so say it's, for instance, it's something like a wren that's all over the place, very rarely stays still, then I'm going to up that shutter speed and just deal with the fact that it might be underexposed to try and draw the detail back, because I might have to throw away an underexposed shot of a wren, but I'm definitely going to have to throw away a blurred shot of a wren. So that's my theory on it. If I'm shooting in shutter priority, I know that pretty much my settings will ensure that I'm shooting wide open. So I don't have an issue with that at all. In terms of my ISO, I'm not scared of ISO. And you shouldn't be scared of ISO when it comes to bird photography, because the key is getting a sharp image, an in focus sharp image. If there's a bit of noise, we can deal with that in post. But if you're looking and going, well, I must shoot at ISO 100, because I don't want any noise, then you're not going to get any images. So what I tend to do is on a day like today, it's reasonably bright. I've got my ISO range on my camera, so I've got auto ISO on, but I've got an ISO range setting, and that range is between 100 and 800 ISO. And invariably it will always shoot at 800 ISO. But what it means is it's not going to be pushing it above that, because I feel that I can shoot at a high enough shutter speed in these lighting conditions to get away with not having to go above 800 ISO. If it's a darker day, then I'll be looking to bring my shutter speed down to 1/250th of a second, and I might push my maximum ISO up in the ISO range to 1250, because it can still get away with that, although it's not as good an image. So that's where I set my ISO range. I use back button focusing, and for me, back button focusing in wildlife photography for me is essential. So what I do is I've got, in my focus mode is continuous AF mode. So basically I am, the whole time I'm focusing in on a bird, my finger is depressed on the back button focus, so it's continually focusing and making adjustments for the bird moving while I'm shooting the shots. Because if you're shooting in a single AF, so you're shooting like, beep beep shot, by the time you've hit that focus button and taken the shot, the bird could have moved ever so slightly, and then you've lost that focus. Whereas if you're shooting in continuous autofocus, then it's there all the time. You're on it all the time, and even though sometimes it will drop in and out, you're much more likely to get the shot with it being on continuous autofocus than you are if you just single focus it and hope, really. And that's why back button focus is so important, because I can literally sit with my thumb depressed on that focus button the whole time, and I can just, even when I'm not shooting it, even when I'm just tracking it, getting ready to shoot it, it's continually hunting and getting the best focus it can on that bird. So back button focus for me is absolutely essential. And then we talk about the focus modes, I guess. So should you use a tripod? This is another question. And there are definitely merits to using a tripod. I don't personally use a tripod, but I can see why you would. Because A, you're definitely going to introduce less camera movement if you're on a tripod. And B, it's not so heavy on the old arms, because these are heavy beasts, these big lenses. That's got to be said. But I think if you use a tripod, you're going to limit yourself to one, maybe two perches for the birds to land on. So with my setup here, a tripod would be an absolute nightmare, because I've got so many different areas that the bird could sit on. You know, there's 1, 2, 3, I'm going to count these out before, but there's about 10, there's probably about 15 spots here across an area of say 3 or 4 square meters that the birds could come and sit on. Now if I'm doing this on a tripod, I've got to move it around and I've got to focus it everywhere and get it all sorted, and by the time that I've reacted to where the bird is, it's probably gone. So if you're setting yourself up with say one tripod, sorry, not one tripod, there's some beautiful light on that bird. The side of that bird, is going to capture that. If you're setting yourself up with say 1 or 2 different perches that the bird's going to come and sit on, then yeah, sure, use a tripod, definitely. All day yesterday and all day today now, there's a male blackbird chasing a female blackbird around, like literally chasing after her everywhere she goes. He goes. She's just gone now, he's just gone. Brilliant. But yeah, if you've just got 1 or 2 perches, then definitely a tripod can't do any harm, can it? And you can sit and focus in on that perch, get everything set up, wait for the bird to come in, and then take the shot. But for me, the reason that I don't do that is, that, as I said before, is the number of perches, but also the reason I've got so many perches is because I want variety. I mean, you know, if you're going to a hide, for instance, somewhere you've never been before, then you can like focus up on 1 or 2 places and shoot away, because you're not going back there, and they'll all be quite sort of new to you, if you like. But when you're sat in your garden, if I had 1 pole, 1 perch or 2 perches, after a while the shots would all look the same. It would just be bird A on perch A, bird B on perch A, bird C on perch A. So I want as much variety as I can possibly get, which is why I've got the logs in, which is why I've got different perches in, which is why I've got different backgrounds, you know, because variety is great, and I would never be able to get those on a tripod. So you've got, you know, I need to be able to react fast. If I see a bird hop onto a perch, there it is, hopped onto the next perch, boom, there it is. Whereas on a tripod, it's going to be cumbersome for me to find that. So tripods are good, tripods are steady, tripods are stable. They'll provide much better stabilisation. If you're confident the birds are only going to land in a single area or maximum a couple of areas, use a tripod. But if you're like me and you set up a variety of areas spanning quite a large range, then a tripod's really going to be a hindrance more than a help. Okay, so let's talk about focusing. Let's talk about the actual what focusing system I use, if you like. So we've already established I use continuous AF and back button focusing, but there are generally two focusing point systems that I use, and one is the single spot AF. And the reason I use the single spot is because, I don't know, I'm sure you know this already, but the key area you need to focus on a bird that has to be in focus for a good shot really is the eye. So I use the single spot, and I'm using my joystick to move that spot around, so I'm composing the shot while focusing the single spot on the eye and making sure that with the joystick that spot then gets the rest of the bird in a decent area of the frame. So for instance, if it's a large bird, if he's facing over to this way, if he's facing over this way, then I'm moving my spot over this way, so it's going to focus on the eye, so his tail is still in here, if that makes sense. So if I've got my spot, I usually start with my spot sort of in the middle here, and if I see the bird facing that way, I'll move the spot over there, and if I see the bird facing that way, I'll move the spot over there, and it's normally higher up because his eye is normally higher than his tail. So that's how I tend to do that. So I'm using single spot focusing, and I'm getting that spot every time I'm trying to hit the bird's eye with that spot. Now if it's dark or darker, the light isn't brilliant, this lens and on this system doesn't focus the best, so it struggles. So then on the Sony I've got the option to use what's called I think it's let's have a look, what's it actually called? It's called Expand Flexible Spot. So basically that gives you your single spot, and flexible means you can move it around. It gives you your single spot, but it also gives you, I think, 2, 3, 4, about 9, I think, spots around that single spot. So if it's dark and it's struggling to pick a bit up, you've got those extra little 9 spots of compensation, if you like, or insurance that you can get the bird. And I'll also use those if the bird's moving a bit faster. So if it's something like I said before, like a wren that's hopping around and moving around a lot, then I'll set it onto that because I've got more chance of getting the eye in focus as it hops out of that focus area, because one of those expanded spots might pick it up. So that's basically what I would do. Now if I were going to do birds in flight, which I don't, then I'd probably pick a wider, you know, like a center area perhaps of focus, and try and keep the bird in the center of the focus and hope that it picks it up that way. Because if you've got a single spot and you're trying to hit a moving target that's moving quite fast on quite a large sensor area, you're going to really struggle. So in that respect, the more focus points you've got at your disposal, the better. And if I were taking a shot of something like a red kite, then I'd probably have the whole like focus across the whole sensor to try and catch it, because it, you know, it's normally pretty good at picking up the movement in modern cameras. So yeah, but for these small birds in the garden, a single spot or a single spot extended, if the light's not great or the bird's moving faster, tend to do the job. And I think finally, for this episode, the last point I want to make is take lots and lots and lots and lots of shots And don't worry about repetition. Don't worry about, you know, like for instance, I used to get loads of sparrows come in the garden all the time. And so I'd take a lot of shots of sparrows, but eventually be like, oh, you know, I'm getting bored with sparrow shots. I wish something different would come in. And so every time a sparrow came in, I kind of stopped taking the shot, really. I just gave up on it and just waited in the hope that something else would turn up. And then eventually the sparrows stopped coming in. So, you know, now when a sparrow comes in, I'm straight in on it. I want to take as many shots of it as I possibly can. So, you know, don't be worried, don't be scared to just take lots of shots of the same bird on the same perch, because, and also at one time it might suddenly do something that shocks you or that surprises you, or that you've got a fantastic image. For instance, I took a lot of pictures of starlings when they first come in the garden, and I took loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of shots, and eventually I got one looking beautiful like an S-curve, and you know, or a, you know, a couple of birds feeding, you know, an adult bird feeding a juvenile bird or something like that. Is take as many shots of the birds as you can. Don't worry about it. You'll throw loads away anyway, but the more shots you take, the more chance you get, the more chance you've got to get that special one, you know. And I would always say as well, although if you shoot, you know, often pretty much every camera shoots a longer buffer of shots in JPEG mode, shoots faster, in some respects shoots more frames per second in JPEG mode, just shoot raw for the birds, because you'll have so much more data to work with at the other end, especially if you find, like I am, that I'm trying to push the shutter speed up and I'm losing some of the exposure. You can't drag that back at all if you're shooting on JPEG. But if you're shooting in RAW, larger file sizes of course, but at least if you're shooting in RAW, you've got more chance of pulling that data back and getting a better shot. So just shoot loads, shoot as much as you can, and just enjoy it. Enjoy sitting out here with the birds, enjoy watching them, enjoy shooting them, enjoy the pleasure that they can give you and the calmness. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this one. Probably a lot of talking, not a lot of video, or not a lot of anything else on this one, but I'll leave you with a few more bird pictures. Next time we'll talk about processing and composition. Bye for now. I did the smile too early. What an idiot.